Hi, it's Kesia and Dominic. Before we start, we want to make a note about this episode of the podcast.
We're going to talk about eugenics, which, as you'll hear, is an outdated set of beliefs that aim to improve the genetic quality of human populations and, by extension, uplift society.
We are discussing eugenics today because it's a subject connected to the famous Five Center for Canadian Women and is something we often receive questions about in that building. As a museum, it is our job to explore the good and the bad of the past. It is important that we do not shy away from discussing difficult subjects.
Nellie McClung, Irene Parlby, Henrietta Muir-Edwards, Louise McKinney, and Emily Murphy all used some tenets of eugenic principles to back up their work. This does not lessen what they achieved, but it's important that we take some time to understand what eugenics was so that we can more fully understand the complexity of history and the people who came before us.
Some of the topics we cover in this episode may be hard to hear, so we want to urge you to take care when listening. Now, on to the podcast.
Welcome to Stories from the Park, a Heritage Park podcast.
Heritage Park is located on Treaty 7 land in Calgary, Alberta, a place where visitors come to learn about the history of all those who have gathered here, and where Indigenous people proudly share cultural traditions and tell stories about their rich heritage, history, and attachment to the land.
Joining us to talk about the history of eugenics today is Dr. Erna Kurbegovic. Hi, Erna. Thanks for doing this.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me.
We're really glad to have you here today to talk with us about the subject of eugenics and a little bit about the famous five and their relationship as well.
Erna, why don't you tell us, I guess, first off, so that we can get kind of a baseline, what is or how is eugenics defined? And I guess where kind of did this idea originate from?
Right. So eugenics, the term comes from Greek meaning well-bred. And it was coined in its modern sense by British statistician Francis Galton in 1883. So the concept of manipulating breeding had been around before Galton's time. So, for example, humans had been breeding plants and animals for thousands of years. But Galton takes these ideas and tried to make eugenics a science and described it as the science of improving stock. So, in other words, improving humans. Galton believed that an individual's mental and moral characteristics were inherited, and any attempt at reforming their environment would not really work because you could not improve these characteristics, essentially. So for him, to ensure that only those with superior heredity passed on their favorable traits, Galton advocated that they should have children, and this is what we call positive eugenics, while those with flawed heredity should be restricted from reproducing, and we call this negative eugenics. Eugenics was also a social movement that emerged in Britain in response to the social conditions over concerns of supposed biological decline. But these ideas of improving humanity were kind of popular all over the world at the turn of the 20th century. And then the wider context here, of course, is that there is greater government intervention in the health of populations starting in the 19th century. Nation states viewed their people as citizens who were the resources of the state. And there was sort of a greater political and social incentive to improve the nation's health and well-being. So eugenics in many ways offered a potential solution to anxieties people had over conditions of modernity due to urbanization, industrialization, impacts of war, etc.
Okay, so it's got a long history, but you mentioned this relationship with the state, and I was thinking in the Canadian context, kind of how accepted were the ideas of eugenics around in Canada in the government and with the society in general?
So they were quite popular. Eugenic ideas were quite popular in Canada. So they reached a peak, or eugenics reaches a peak kind of in the 1920s and 1930s here, and eugenic policies and laws were implemented in 2 Canadian provinces, with Alberta introducing a Sexual Sterilization Act in 1928 and British Columbia following in 1933. This, of course, doesn't mean that other provinces were not trying to follow in the footsteps of Alberta and British Columbia. It's just that due to a number of complex reasons, these campaigns never really materialized. Eugenics was supported by many middle-class Canadians, including social reformers, first-wave feminists, medical professionals, and politicians. And it was basically because they believed that it was scientific and progressive and that it would improve humanity. For them, eugenics also was a way to explain many of Canada's social problems, including poverty, crime, criminality. And then we sort of see at the turn of the century, with increased immigration, World War I, the Great Depression, these prominent individuals became concerned about what they termed as mental deficiency and feeble-mindedness. And a number of, this was primarily promoted by psychiatrists and by physicians. So to assess the mental health status of Canadians, Canadian psychiatrist Clarence Hinks and C.K. Clark founded the Canadian National Committee for Mental Hygiene in 1918. And this committee had an extensive mandate. It was interested in mental well-being of soldiers who had returned home from war, but it was also interested in combating mental deficiency and in fighting crime and prostitution. And the committee conducted provincial surveys across Canada to assess the well-being of the provinces, and its conclusions were primarily negative. So it found that there was a rise of what they called mental deficiency and feeble-mindedness in mental institutions, and of course, these ideas that these findings find a very receptive audience in Alberta, especially.
Was there a kind of a set guideline that this, or was it, in scientific, I guess, or how you say science, right? And how they make this into a science. But was there like a set, this is yes and this is no, or was it kind of up to the person who was doing this kind of assessment?
You mean in terms of who would be classified?
Correct.
Yeah, so not really. I mean, when we talk about mental deficiency or feeble-mindedness, these were very broad. Scholars have described them as catch-all terms. They were very broad, very imprecise. So it was essentially a way to group a vast number of marginalized individuals under this label of feeble-minded or mentally deficient.
So when you mentioned that Alberta, especially, I guess, kind of latched on to these kind of ideas, and BC then followed with its own in the legislative sense, why do you think that people latched on to them? What made them appealing to them?
In Alberta in particular, in the 1920s, there's economic downturn. People are a bit concerned about about their livelihoods. That is then coupled with increased immigration to the province, and there is a rise of nativist sentiment. So this really creates ripe conditions in Alberta, particularly for the rise of eugenics. Alberta's mental health care system was also not very well developed compared to other provinces. It's at this point, it only had one institution, so the Panoka Mental Hospital. And that was being overcrowded. It was sending its patients kind of to other parts of Canada. And then Alberta is also kind of watching what's happening in the US. So they are very much influenced by what's happening in California, by the sexual sterilization legislation there from 1909. And this would later become a model for Alberta's own eugenics program. And then, of course, this idea of it being progressive, right? They believed that it offered a possibility for a better society based on the best available science. So And then, of course, there's that fear, which I sort of hinted at, the fear of new immigrants, the fear of national decline as a result. So,
how are people in the 20th century using eugenics besides just informing legislation like the Sexual Sterilization Act?
One of the ways where we think about eugenics would be through segregation. So segregation in mental institutions for eugenic reasons. So initially, individuals who eugenicists would call mentally defective were segregated in institutions to ensure that they did not reproduce. But soon this wasn't good enough, and eugenicists started to call for tougher measures. They argued that institutions were becoming overcrowded, the cost to run them was draining provincial resources, and more stricter measures like sterilization were necessary to ensure that these individuals did not pass on their genes to future generations. So that was one way. The other was to support immigration restrictions. So like I mentioned, during the late 19th and early 20th century, there was an influx of new immigrants to the prairie provinces, primarily from Eastern Europe. And this changed the makeup of those provinces and led to increasing anxiety among dominant Anglo-Canadians about national degeneration, and then contributed to popular support for eugenic programs and, of course, to call for immigration restrictions. I mentioned the Canadian National Committee for Mental Hygiene, and their findings suggested that new immigrants were overrepresented in institutions, and that they tended to suffer from quote-unquote feeble-mindedness. So people started to really criticize the Canadian government for its immigration policy, and argued that its medical inspections were not adequate because they were letting in undesirable immigrants. It's interesting because the Immigration Act underwent revisions in 1906 and 1910 to prohibit entry to anyone who was, seen medically unfit, mentally or physically disabled, destitute. But for eugenicists, this wasn't good enough. They wanted more thorough medical inspections performed at the country of origin rather than when those individuals already landed in Canada. So those were kind of the two other ways other than the sexual sterilization that eugenics kind of manifested itself in policies.
So we know that the support for this was, across the spectrum, but you talk about progressives, socialists, farmers, we've read about many kind of Anglo-Saxon Protestants believe that, especially in Western Canada, that you can produce like an ideal society, as you were saying, by reducing fertility. But we're often asked here at the park about a group of women who would be known as feminists and the famous five: Irene Parlby, Nellie McClung, Henrietta Muir Edwards, Emily Murphy, and Louise McKinney, and their connection to eugenic principles and practices. So how were these women, involved in using or promoting eugenic principles in Western Canada?
So all of these women were passionate supporters of eugenics, particularly Emily Murphy, Nellie McClung, and Irene Parlby. And like many social reformers of their time, the famous five were what we call maternal feminists. So they believed that in their role as mothers, that they were particularly suited in bettering society through social reform. And McClung and Murphy believed that it was a woman's duty to ensure the success of future generations. Women were seen as mothers of the race, whose duty was to have children and ensure the survival of the Anglo-Saxon race. And of course, this was only reserved for some women. It's a bit complicated. Only upper middle class women of superior backgrounds could be the mothers of the race. When working women and poor women could not. So their interests in social improvement particularly in areas of health, linked these women to the eugenics movement, which tended to share similar goals. And women's organizations and eugenics were intertwined and complemented one another's beliefs in human betterment and social reform, and in biological solutions to social problems. So I think given this overlap, it's not surprising that the famous five also supported eugenics. For example, Murphy, in her work as a magistrate in Alberta, reviewed insanity cases before those individuals were transferred to Ponoka Mental Hospital. And in her work, she saw a connection between quote unquote insanity and social ills, including alcoholism, poverty, and crime. And she thought that insanity led to all of these social ills. So together with McClung and Parlby, she played a significant role in advocating for sexual sterilization in Alberta, and thought that the public needed to be made aware of the threat posed by those deemed to be mentally deficient. She was also a contributor to local newspapers, where she called for sterilization, claiming that those who were insane were not entitled to children. Similarly, Murphy conducted lecture tours together with British political activist and suffragist Emmeline Pankhurst, where she addressed several issues, including the supposed increase of insanity and feeble-mindedness in Alberta. And these lectures essentially served as a vehicle to spread the eugenic message and garner support for eugenic measures across Canada, especially across the prairie provinces. So McClung was particularly interested in advocating for sterilization for feeble-minded girls. So she believed in sort of in humanitarian reasons, so to protect these young women from pregnancy and the burden of parenthood. And then Louise McKinney, it's unclear what her position on sexual sterilization was, but we do know that she was a supporter of immigration restrictions to prevent undesirable immigrants from entering Canada. And then Henrietta Muir Edwards supported both sterilization and immigration restrictions. Parlby, who was the first president of the United Farm Women of Alberta and the first female cabinet minister, she was particularly interested in matters relating to women and children. And I think it's important to note that under her leadership, the United Farm Women of Alberta successfully lobbied the provincial government for a number of health-related policies, including training for public health nurses, school medical inspections, as well as helping or pushing the government to establish the Department of Public Health in 1919. But Parlby's interests in public health would ultimately cross paths with eugenic ideas. In the 1920s, she played a prominent role, just like Murphy, in educating the public about the dangers posed by defectives. And she believed that there were three ways of dealing with this danger, and it was either through segregation, through health certificates before marriage, so essentially to ensure that people were fit to marry, and through sterilization, which she viewed as the best solution. And of course, this was all discussed in her 1924 address to the United Farm Women membership of Alberta membership. And it was later circulated to the public by the Provincial Department of Health and published in the United Farmer of Alberta newspaper. And I also think it's important to point that Parlby's position in government as cabinet minister from 1921 to 1935 is important regarding eugenics. Not only now that farm women have one of their own in cabinet, but they also had a direct connection to the government. And many of its resolutions regarding sexual sterilization ended up on the desk of the premier. And I would suggest even served as a blueprint for the Alberta Sexual Sterilization Act.
So Erna, can you tell us a little bit more about the Sexual Sterilization Act in Alberta and its impact on the population?
Yeah. So when Alberta passed the Sexual Sterilization Act in 1928, it allowed for creation of a eugenics board to administer the program. And medical superintendents of Alberta psychiatric institutions were granted permission by this act to present patients to the board who they thought should be sterilized. So earlier in the program, these patients primarily arrived from the Ponoka Mental Hospital. But by the 1950s, most of those who were being presented to the board arrived from the provincial training school in Red Deer. So in order for the procedure to take place, unanimous decision was required, and initially consent by the patient, parent, or guardian was required. But in 1937, there was an amendment to the Sexual Sterilization Act, which essentially removed the consent clause for those deemed to be mentally deficient. So from 1928 until 1972, when the act is repealed, the Eugenics Board recommended over 4,700 people to be sterilized. And out of this number, over 2,800 were actually sterilized. So it's pretty significant, yeah.
So a lot of these ideas that these women had that were good are also intermingled with these eugenics principles. So it's kind of this complicated intermingling of different ideas based on their belief systems and understandings of science and such at the time. So that kind of leads me to this question about what leads to the downfall of eugenic principles in Canada? Where do we go from this rise in the 20s and 30s to kind of them becoming passé and old science and not supported anymore?
Mm-hmm. So we really see a decline. Kind of eugenic ideas start to decline a little bit earlier in some of the other provinces, maybe in the 1940s. And this is primarily because in the other provinces, they've kind of tried their hand at bringing in eugenic legislation, and it doesn't really work. So it sort of peters out. But I think after 1945, the most significant reason why eugenic policies become discredited is because of their association with euthanasia programs that targeted psychiatric patients, among others, in Nazi Germany. So that's kind of the number one reason. Secondly, there is much more scientific scrutiny of eugenics. So scientists did start to criticize eugenic ideas in the 1910s, and they kind of challenged the eugenicist claims regarding the heritability of feeble-mindedness and mental deficiency, arguing that these were based on weak research, poor data, and most importantly, a very simplistic understanding of human heredity. Essentially, if feeble-mindedness did exist, it would never be wiped out in a single generation. So these scientific critiques are then adopted by those who oppose eugenics in Canada, particularly Roman Catholics. And in their campaign against sterilization, Catholics relied partly on these scientific arguments to question eugenicists' interpretations of heredity. And because they did this, it helped them kind of reach a wider audience. They were just not just focusing on theological arguments, but also went with kind of a scientific argument to appeal to non-Catholics. We also see that a lot of eugenic organizations lose their financial support during this time. So we see a decline there. But interestingly, despite the fact that we see this decline in a number of other provinces and actually in a number of other countries, Alberta's eugenics program was slowly chugging along in the background.
So when, obviously we don't hear about it now, so when did it die in Alberta?
So in 1972, the legislation was repealed. It did take some time. So like I was saying, despite the fact that all these other places were really kind of decommissioning their eugenic legislation due to various reasons, discrediting of eugenic ideas, insufficient public finances, increase in public scrutiny, Alberta's legislation just kind of remained unchallenged. And we think this was because there was a strong populist government at this time. There was very little opposition to this. This program kind of operated in the background without really being in the public view. There was also economic growth and prosperity in the province during this period, kind of the post-war period, and not much attention was really being paid to the eugenics program. So it would take a change of government in 1972 to repeal the Sexual Sterilization Act, and they did that primarily for two reasons. One, it was based on outdated medical science, and more importantly, two, they viewed it as a violation of human rights.
Is there a line to be drawn to, I know that it's not as overt possibly today, and you may counter that, but is there something today that we can kind of look at and say, is it totally gone, or is there has it evolved into something else that we could be looking at and say, this kind of mirrors those sorts of principles?
I think there would be a number of scholars who would argue, and myself as well, that eugenics never fully disappeared. It was just repackaged. So we often talk about newgenics. So we talk that we still have, for instance, prenatal testing to screen for certain diseases, right? We still want people to undergo genetic counseling if they do carry certain genetic diseases. So those ideas kind of still exist, although not in the same way as they did, back in the day. And you could argue, we always talk about like designer babies and whether or not in the future people will be able to choose, like the eye color of their children or something like that. Yeah. So I don't think those ideas completely disappeared. They're just different now. And I think a number of disability scholars would suggest that some of that stuff is still around. Yeah.
Thanks, Erna, for coming on and having this conversation. It's a hard one to have, but we've talked about here at the park before of, not always, it's not always easy to talk about history, and it's one of those things that we shouldn't shy away from and that we should know about. So
I agree completely. I think it's important that in regards to the famous five, I think it's certainly important that we discuss kind of the totality of their careers, including their achievements, but also, the shortcomings and their views on some of these controversial policies and programs. So yeah.
Yeah, we want to make sure that we're always exploring kind of that big totality of people being people. They're not
exactly. Yeah.
People are human. We all make mistakes, or we all think things that we learn about later we're not correct. So
exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming to talk.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for inviting me.
thanks, Erna.